Justin, feel free to reintroduce yourself if you like.
Sure. Yeah. Wanted to set the stage for this first session by talking a little bit about the invasion process. And again, I'm Justin Bush and I coordinate the Washington Invasive Species Council. Joey?
Yeah, and I'm Joey Hulbert. Here again, you've gotten a lot of emails from me. I'm at Washington State University and have funding from USDA, APHIS to run workshops like this and provide educational materials. So you'll hear more from me throughout. As we know, there's a lot of impacts from invasive species, and they impact us in many different ways, our environment, economically, culturally, and the impacts can be quite dramatic and quite severe. There's a number of ways that these organisms are introduced to our environments or our communities. We call these pathways occasionally, and so they're pathways of introduction, and some of them are very common in the pet trade. You may have heard of zebra mussels and quagga mussels. Sometimes those are found in aquariums, right? And so it's one of those pathways that's really concerning, and something we need to be careful about. It's possible to move seeds and spores of fungal or disease-causing organisms on your boots. So if you're traveling to ancestral berry patches, things like that, it's important to consider what you're carrying on your boots as well. Clearly, vehicles and containers. In the Northwest, we have a lot of ports of entry where there's possible introductions of invasive species. Occasionally, this affects us because we're importing materials ourselves, and that material may be quarantined and sent back. For example, if you're importing fireworks and there's an insect, a priority insect in the wood pallets that those fireworks are coming in, USDA, APHIS, or the state may refuse that shipment, and that could affect you indirectly through a quarantine. The trade of live plants is a major pathway for invasive microbes, particularly those that harm plants, plant pathogens. They love to grow in these lush nursery settings. And then, of course, the things, you can watch YouTube videos on individuals telling you how to pack a plant in your suitcase and take it home to another part of the world. And so there's lots of different pathways that these things can be introduced. And it's really a complex issue and difficult to manage. And so it really requires all of us to be involved.
The overarching theme, I would say, is humans and human activities. And, those pathways all involve humans. So the takeaway is that to solve this problem, humans need to take some action. And we wanted to explain that this is a global issue. None of the invasive species that we're facing are inherently bad. They're just in the wrong place. And humans were responsible for moving them from their native range to a new environment. And some of those species are not a problem at all, but others become a very big problem and start to impact our resources and require some management in order to stop the spread and address it. So it is really a global issue that's being addressed at all the scales you see here. But I think the main takeaway is that we all have a role to play from whatever scale we're operating in to solve this problem. And it's truly a problem that we all face. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Well, I'm just seeing how we're already getting behind on time, so we'll rush through this part. But we wanted to emphasize that there's multiple scales, and this is really critical when you're thinking about whether on a national scale, USDA may decide to deregulate an invasive species like emerald ash borer, but on your tribal lands or on your community lands, that still may not be there, and it may be important to take action. So scale is really important when you're talking about the impacts. It may have it may be nationally distributed, but you still might take action on your own property if you're interested in reducing the impacts in a specific area. There's also a lot of different initiatives and regulations and management agencies and groups that act on these different scales, from global to national invasive species councils to Western Governors Association, like Western Regional approaches. And then, as Justin represents the Washington Invasive Species Council, there's state organizations. But there's also a specific there may be a need to develop a specific management plan for your tribal lands. And so there is examples of tribal groups or confederated tribes that have come up with these management plans for taking different action on their tribal lands than would be prescribed by the state or the federal jurisdictions. The last thing we wanted to highlight is this invasion curve, and there's just a lot is going forward in this symposium or in this workshop. It's important to it's important to think about this. Like, are we talking about an invasive species that's established and really difficult to control? Or are we talking about something that just barely has arrived or hasn't arrived yet? And depending on where that kind of invasive species is in this invasion stage, really determines how much resources and what we can do. So go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, and I think that also wanted to point out that this invasion curve can be applied at different scales. And that's something that we need to think about when we're prioritizing what we can manage. No organization has all the funding and resources to address every problem, but this invasion curve can be applied at various scales. And really, when you're thinking about stopping the spread of invasive species or managing this problem, it's like river mile to river mile, one property to another, one field to the next. And so, thinking about these different management objectives at your site specific level is really key. And as we're thinking about priorities, just because something might not be a national priority doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a priority when it first arrives on your tribal lands. If it's new, perhaps you should manage it, is what we're kind of saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you could think of it as opportunities to invest, or areas where you might invest your energy or your resources, or depending on the invasive species, you might decide to really invest in putting a lot of resources into preventing that from coming to your lands. Whereas instead, if it's already established or arrives, then you might be monitoring or looking for to detect it early. Detecting it early gives you the opportunity to try and eradicate it. If you can eradicate it, then it reduces the impact because it doesn't get to this stage in this invasion curve. But if you can't eradicate it, then you're really left with trying to contain it to certain areas or mitigate its impacts. And a lot of time we're spending all of our resources or a lot of our resources on just restoring really degraded areas from an invasive species. So as Justin mentioned, there's a lot of issues that we're faced with, all these pathways that we're faced with. It's difficult and challenging, and there's not a lot of resources. So it's really critical that we consider where should we invest our resources, and is it an invasive species like Scotch broom on the west side of Washington, where a little bit of management isn't going to have much impact, but it will be really expensive. The last thing we want to highlight is that we're in this together. If your neighbor on the other side of the fence does nothing to manage invasive species, but you spend a lot of resources in it, then you're constantly going to be battling on that fence line. And so really, as Justin mentioned earlier, it's like a human issue, and we need to communicate and work together. And sometimes education might be the best route because it can help the community come together on a certain issue. The last thing here is just to highlight that Justin and I and Robert are all here as resources. We're really in this space where we want to organize more events like this and more opportunities like this. So please reach out to us if we can be of any help. So I'm gonna hand it over now. Justin, do you have any final notes?
No, just like to reemphasize that, as Joey said, Joey's a great resource to assist. Robert Compton is. I am as well. You know, it's whatever your issue is probably a shared issue, and ultimately, if we can all work together, we're all going to be better off. So yeah, thank you. On to the next talk, I believe.
Yeah, we're next round of your